All right, well, if you're new with us, we've been in a series out of 1 John. I'm going to jump into that today. And I want to jump in with a story. This week as I was reflecting on, as we're going to move into chapter 2 of 1 John, I was reflecting on the reality of obedience, because you're going to see in a moment that there's some talk in this set of verses about obedience. And I was thinking about obedience in my own life, and I was brought back to my little Corey self, 4-year-old Corey. And I remember 4-year-old Corey sitting at his parents'. My parents had bought their first house, and it was all they could afford. They bought it right by the airport, so I remember airplanes flying over our house constantly. But we loved that little greenhouse on A Street. And I remember this vivid memory that as I was still young, my parents, my mom grew up on a farm, and my dad was from a small town. My parents ate liver on a regular basis. Any of you love liver? You willing to confess to that? Anyone? No? Okay. Yeah, me too. Now, I thought it was disgusting. The smell of liver is awful, let alone the taste of liver. And so as a little boy, my parents tried to ease me into it, a couple bites at a time, and then they would let me go. But this one particular evening, my dad decided it was time to draw a line in the sand, and it was time for me to listen and to obey him. And so he said, "You're going to finish all of the liver on your plate, or you are not going to go outside and play with your friends." And it was the old Western standoff, my dad versus me, and my dad won. I have this vivid memory of sitting literally at the table with this stinky piece of liver in front of me for 2 hours, watching all my friends ride their bikes and their big wheels out the front window. It was a test of obedience that I absolutely failed, but I don't regret it, because liver is disgusting. Now listen, we've been in this 1 John series, and what we're doing is a couple of times a year, we go straight through a book of the Bible. And the reason we do that is because one of the number one things we hear in the life of a church is people go, "I really struggle reading the Bible. Like, I feel kind of intimidated by it, or I feel overwhelmed by it, or when I get into it, I don't understand it." And so our goal in this series is literally just to read through chapter by chapter in the way that you would read through it if you're at home, sitting at your kitchen table or in your bedroom or wherever you might choose to read. We're going to try to read through it, asking questions that you would ask and trying to answer, what did this mean for the people that John was writing to? And then what might this mean to us? And our goal is frankly just to build confidence, that we don't just get to open the scriptures together on Sundays, which is really beautiful, but also that you can do that on your own and that you can get a lot out of it. So as we've been moving through 1 John, one of the things we've seen is that there's 2 major themes that John builds this letter on that he's writing. It's actually less of a letter and more of a sermon. We talked about that a few weeks ago, but he builds it on light and he builds it on love. And what we talked about last week was that to live in the light means you have to really expose yourself. You have to be open to God and to people and say, "Hey, here's what's inside of me. Here's where I'm at," in a way that you're open to say, "I want to change and I want to grow and I don't want to hold on to any darkness that's in me." This week, what we're going to look at is some really practical, tangible, what are going to be really seen as tests that show up around what does your life actually look like when you're living in the light if you choose daily to live into obedience and to live into love. We're going to take a look at what John has to say about that. When we do these series, we partner with a group called the Bible Project. They have these great overview videos, and so I picked like a 2-minute clip out of their overview video that has some of the themes for today. So let's take a listen.
This is the message. God is light. This is the message of the apostles, that the God revealed in Jesus is light. And so, if people want to participate in God's own life through Jesus, they need to keep walking in the light, which is a really cool image, but what does it mean? It means, for John, to keep Jesus' commands. And that's hard, so when you fail, Jesus' atoning death will cover for your sins. And then once again, you're called to get up and obey Jesus' teachings. But which one of his teachings? John reminds the churches of Jesus' old/new command given to the disciples at the Last Supper, that they love one another as he loved them. Doing this is walking in the light. Now, if God's light is now shining through Jesus, then that means the world's darkness is passing away, which also means that God's children already in this moment have victory over the sin and evil and death that reigns in the world. And so that leads John to challenge the churches, don't love the world, because it's passing away too. He's referring here specifically to pride and sexual corruption. Likely, these are problems connected to the conflict that was happening in the churches. And so this leads John to warn the churches about these people who have left the communities and who deny Jesus as the Messiah. John calls them the anti-messiahs and deceivers. But he's confident that those who still know the truth about Jesus are, in fact, the true children of God. And they are loved by the Father. And they show that they're part of God's family when they do righteousness and when they love one another, unlike the deceivers who are generating anger and strife and division.
Okay, there we go. So obviously that video continues on. It's like an 8-minute video. But that's showing us some of the themes that we're going to get into in the text today. And what I want to do, we're in chapter 2, and you have to remember that when the writers wrote, there weren't chapters, right? We have done that hundreds of years later. We've put chapters and verses in them. So this is just a letter that John is writing. And what's really helpful when you're reading the Bible on your own is to read through a whole section. Maybe you start with a chapter, but read through a whole section that seems to have a theme, and pay attention to the introduction and the closing, because so often the author is placing the most important things there that creates the space for everything else that they want to say. And so we want to pay attention to those. It's a little bit like in this section, what you're going to find is it's one of those movies, you know those movies that open up, the opening scene is like the end of the movie? Do you know these? You get a snapshot of what's going to happen at the end, and then all of a sudden it says 3 days earlier, and then you actually start the movie and you watch it through knowing that you've seen part of one of the final scenes. That's a little bit of what's happening in chapter 2 today. And so I'm going to take you to one of the final scenes, and that's in verse 18 and 19. John says this, where the video ended. Dear children, this is the last hour. And as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. This is how we know it is the last hour. They went out from us, but they did not really belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained with us, but their going showed that none of them belonged to us. This is actually a pretty famous passage because people like to guess and think about who the Antichrist is, right? Like right now in the world, who's the Antichrist? Who do people think? Do you know? Trump. Yeah, Trump. I was thinking Putin. But, we'll leave it there. So there's a lot. So this is a pretty famous passage because people like to do this conversation about it. And I think it's important to understand the context. So if you're at home reading your Bible, one of the things I always do, watch a video like this before I jump in, or grab a commentary off of BibleGateway.com just to get the context. Why is John actually writing this letter? And one of the things that we learn when we read the background is that John is very concerned about these anti-messiahs, these antichrists. He presents them as a real danger to the current church. And what we find is that many scholars, when you study this book, they believe the entire letter is actually a test for people to figure out, number one, to look at themselves in the mirror and go, am I walking in the light and am I walking in love? And then, am I in community with people who are doing the same? So it's an inward test and an outward test. And John is really emphasizing the outward test because what he's saying is these antichrists who have shown up, they're in it for their own agenda. They don't really believe that Jesus is Savior and Lord, but they have an agenda, and most of that is taking advantage of these Christians. They were making money off of them, and they were making claims, and they were getting a following. And so you might say in today's vernacular that these antichrists were building a brand. And John is very concerned about that because it's not the gospel that he taught or that any of the other apostles taught. And so he's saying, I'm going to give you a few tests so that you have a clear sense of who it is that's actually walking in the light. And I want you to apply it to yourself, and I want you to apply it to your community because you're going to figure out some people who really aren't committed to Jesus. It's a little bit, I was thinking this week, I don't know why I was thinking about movies, but you know the original Men in Black? The idea of Men in Black, Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith, they're alien hunters, but the aliens come and they take over human bodies. So when you're walking around the city, I think in the first movie, it's an alien comes and takes over a farmer's body, I believe is how the movie goes. And Will Smith, they have to figure out who it is, which body is the alien in. And that's a little bit of what John is doing in this chapter, saying, here's some tests to figure out which one is not like the others. And so what I want to do is I want to read the text, and then we'll just jump into a few of the tests, and we'll try to apply it to ourselves. So here's the text for today, starting chapter 2, verse 3. We know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Whoever says, I know him, but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in them. This is how we know we're in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. Dear friends, I'm not writing you a new command, but an old one, which you have had since the beginning. This old command is the message you've heard, yet I'm writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him, Jesus, and in you, because the darkness is passing and the true light is already shining. Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. Anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there is nothing in them to make them stumble. But anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. They do not know where they are going because the darkness has blinded them. And then we jump to 15. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, come not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. Okay, so we come now to the Apostle John saying, here's some tests I want you to apply to your life and to the community that you're living in. And so let's just jump into them. Verses 3 through 6. If we want to put 3 through 6 up there, the first question is, do you obey Jesus? That's the first test. Do you obey? Now, I know in America, we don't like this language, obey. We don't like obedience. That feels like a master and their pet, their dog. But the word obey, and this theme comes up a lot in the New Testament. The New Testament is not allergic to this idea of bending the knee to Jesus as Lord and following him. We as Americans might be allergic to that idea, but the New Testament is not. And the New Testament uses these words like obey quite a bit, and you see them in the text. Now, I think it's important to get clear on what John's not saying. John is not saying that obedience equals perfection. Okay, so if you hear obedience, do you obey? And you go, well, failed that test, I'm out, let's get out. That's not what John is saying. John is talking about the disposition of your heart. He's saying, is your heart bent towards wanting to say yes to Jesus? That doesn't mean you do it every time, but just the general attitude and disposition of your heart is that you want to say yes to Jesus. When he presents something to you, you go, listen, the posture is one of learning and submitting and following him. There's actually this really beautiful scene where this happens, I think, like in a real poignant moment for the Apostle Peter. It's in Luke chapter 5, and it's one of his first encounters with Jesus. And in Luke chapter 5, here's what we're going to read. I think we'll get it. When he had finished speaking, that is Jesus, he had been preaching, he said to Simon Peter, now go out where it is deeper and let down your nets to catch some fish. Master, Simon replied, we worked hard all last night and didn't catch a thing, but if you say so, I'll let the nets down again. Now, we're just going to keep this up here in this last phrase, but if you say so, we'll do it. If you say so, I will. How many of you have spent a night fishing? Literally like the whole night. No, okay. So I grew up in Nebraska, as many of you know, and I was a part of a cat fishing team, and we would go to tournaments. I know I look like that guy, don't I? I know that's exactly what you're thinking. Listen, for the better part of 3 or 4 years, I was on a cat fishing team. Like we would go out and we would fish competitions. And you would start at 7 p.m. at night and you would end at 7 a.m. in the morning. And listen, when you were catching fish and you could be in the money, it was exhilarating. The adrenaline was running. It was awesome. And you were working hard. But when you didn't catch fish, it was the worst. I mean, by 4 or 5 a.m., there were some tournaments that we literally just loaded up our boat at like 5:30 in the morning. We're like, we're out. This has been awful. We're not even staying for the weigh-in. We don't want to see those losers who win the money because we didn't get it. And like, it's the worst because you're like, I skipped the night of sleep and your rhythms are off. And this is exactly where Peter finds himself. And Peter is a professional fisherman. Peter knows that some nights the fish just don't bite. And yet Jesus shows up and says, hey, go right back out to where you're fishing before and trust me. Will you obey me? And Peter basically says, no one else would I do this for but you, Jesus. I wonder for you and for me in our life today as we walk into this place, do you have a because you say so, I will circumstance going on in your life right now? Like, is there a place where Jesus is saying to you, hey, go drop the nets down over there? And you're just finding yourself very resistant? Maybe for you, I would categorize this as like a wrestling with God. Maybe that's how you think about it. Where am I wrestling with God? Where I think I know he's saying something, but honestly, in my heart of hearts and in my will, I don't want to do it. For some of you, it could be that you've been in debt and you feel the Spirit of God tapping you on the shoulder and saying, hey, it's time. Let's do the hard work. Let's start living with a budget. Let's do the work for the next 2 or 3 years so you can be generous. Like, this is what I've built you for, but you can't when you're in debt. For some of you, it's a broken relationship that will only be mended if you take the first step, but honestly, your pride is in the way of that. For some of you, it could be that you've put a gift that you have on a shelf. Maybe God used to use you in certain ways, produce fruit in your life. He gave you a gift, and you've put that on the shelf for whatever reason, and he's tapping you on the shoulder saying, hey, come on, let's go. And you're like, man, that's gonna cost me time, and that's gonna cost me energy, and that's gonna cost me intentionality, and like other people can do that. Maybe for some of you sitting here today and you came in, you have an addiction in your life. And the Lord's been saying, hey, come on, let's do something together. And so what I wanna encourage us is, what if we saw this conversation like, it's easy to go, oh man, obedience is so hard, but what if you saw obedience through the lens of invitation? Because here's the thing about Peter. I believe this moment changed the rest of Peter's life. It changed the rest of his life. Peter didn't know in this moment, by taking that boat out there and saying yes, but because you say so, Lord, I will. He did not know this would change everything for him. We still talk about Peter. We read what Peter wrote 2,000 years later, mostly because of this moment. And I wonder for you and for me, do we have this moment sitting in our life right now where Jesus will say, hey, come on. It's an invitation, let's go. You've been wrestling and now it's time to say yes and let's go, because I've got things for you that you never could have dreamed or imagined. But you're gonna have to trust me, you're gonna have to obey me, you're gonna have to say yes. That's test number 1, do you obey Jesus? Test number 2, do you love? Do you love well? We'll throw the verses up here. Dear friends, I'm not writing you a new command, but an old one. And they would have known what this is. Let me just pause here. Have any of you watched the series The Chosen? I'm late to the game on this. I'm the worst pastor ever. So sorry. Just found out about The Chosen, binge watched it in like 2 weeks, 2 seasons. And one of the things I've loved about The Chosen, I highly recommend it if you haven't watched it, is that they create these scenes that are extra biblical. That is, we actually don't have a record in the Bible of these conversations happening, but you watch them and you're like, I think that might have happened. That could have happened. So you see all these scenes where when the disciples are coming together to follow Jesus, there's all these scenes where they're by themselves, where Jesus is out doing something and he's not with them. And they have all these arguments. And they're critical of one another, and they judge each other. And you can imagine, like, the fishermen, they're very upset with Matthew, the tax collector, because they see him as a traitor. And then, of course, the zealot sees Matthew that way. And so everybody's really hard on Matthew. And the way they record these scenes is really interesting because they're very unkind to each other, and they're very critical, and they're very judgmental. And I'm like, yeah, I can imagine that happening. And so that puts context then when Jesus is getting to the end of his life, it's the week he's going to die, and he's now saying what's most important. And we do know from the scripture that Jesus heard some of these conversations, some of these back and forths, because there is a moment where Jesus hears them and he calls them all together and he does a lesson around who's the greatest in the kingdom. And so we imagine Jesus heard some of these, but we get to the end of his life, and in John 13, when John is saying, you know the old commandment that we heard, this is it. This is the first time Jesus gives it. A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. You go, well, how do we know what love is? 1 John 3:16. Later in this letter, John's going to go, if you don't know what we're talking about, this philosophical, remember today we're talking about actual, really practical things in your life. How do you live in the light? Do you obey? Then this next test is, do you love? The way that you know that you love is that Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. And I believe what Jesus was saying is, hey, y'all, if we can't figure out how to love each other in here, we're never going to do it out there. And so I think the challenge for us is to assess kind of where are we at with the people of God? You know, it's in our nature in the same way it was in the disciples' natures to be kind of judgy of one another, to be critical of one another. Maybe not people in this church. You go, hey, this is my church. These are my people. I like them. There's a reason I'm here, and I get that. But maybe there's other kinds of churches that you watch in the news or that your family is a part of or, you know, whatever it is, and you go, man, it's one thing to not understand people. It's an entire another thing to be critical and judgmental and not want to live in fellowship with them. And John says that, remember, Jesus said, if we're going to change the world, it starts in here. And so the test for us is, are we loving our literal brother and sister that live in this community? Let's not just assume that, but is there evidence in our life that we're putting someone else first, that we're preferring others first, that we are laying down our lives so that other people can get ahead, so that other people can be served, that their gifts can be preferred, that they can live into all that God has for them? It's not just when I'm around church people, it's just about me and what am I getting out of it. I'm thinking about everybody else and what are they getting out of it, and are they connecting with God, and are they using their gifts, trusting that if I put God's purposes and his design first, that he'll take care of my needs then. And so John says, never forget, we can't change anything out there if we don't start by loving in here. Test number 2 is, do you love? Test number 3, verses 9 through 11, do you hold hatred in your heart? Anyone who claims to be in the light but hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. And he goes on to spell out what that means. And listen, there's so many things we could say about this, but for me, this verse just came home again this week as I was thinking about, we're entering the election cycle again, right? Of course you do. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. Can't just do it every 4 years. We got to just, So listen, midterms are coming and all the things are heating up and you're watching all the rhetoric and, the raid on Mar-a-Lago and just all the things, right? And what I want to say to us is when we read from John, John's just going, hey, the disposition of your heart really matters. If you find yourself holding something against someone, that's problematic. Because Jesus held nothing against you. As a matter of fact, Jesus paid it all for you. He paid it all. And so John is saying, listen, there's people in your midst that don't care about people, and they hate people, and the proof is in the pudding. That's not you if you're a follower of Jesus. Jesus is asking you to let go of that hatred and to let him be judge and for you to bless and to serve. And so the question for us is, do we hold hatred in our heart? That's a legitimate test. If we run the inventory of our life and just go, are there people that I'm really judging and that I'm critical of and that I'm harsh towards and I wouldn't even give a chance? And, we go, man, you voted for Trump. You're a moron. You voted for Biden. Man, he's an old man. Whatever it is for you. John says, a test here is that we don't hold hatred in our heart. And so I wonder for you, who's the hardest person in your life right now? You're just being honest. You don't have to tell anybody. It's between you and the Lord. A family member, a coworker, a difficult neighbor. Who's the hardest person in your life right now? And I wonder if the Spirit of God would whisper to you about something you could do to bless that person in the next few weeks. And just go, God, I'm going to take this test seriously. I'm not going to hold hatred in my heart. I'm going to prefer and defer, and I'm going to bless them even if I don't think they deserve it. And you know what? They probably don't. And just understand that you're a difficult person for someone too. But do you hold hatred in your heart? John says it's one of the things that to be in the people of God, we have to consistently be coming back and weighing our heart before the Lord and going, Lord, I don't want to hold anything over anybody. And then we land here. The fourth test here is, which kingdom do you crave more? Which kingdom do you crave more? And in verse 15, it says, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life come not from the Father, but from the world. John is talking about appetites here. And appetites are very powerful things. We just went on vacation with some friends of ours, and they have 2 teenage boys, and there were 10 of us, and I am not exaggerating when I say the 2 teenage boys out-ate the other 8 of us. It was amazing to watch. I mean, it literally was like it was just incredible. It was like every 75 minutes, they were bringing another round of food out and another plate. I was like, where are you putting this? Their appetites were crazy. In our home, my wife, I think, is funny. I don't know, maybe some of you will say this is what you do, but my wife has a real conviction that we should not eat the same kind of meat in back-to-back nights. I don't know what this is. So, like, if you have beef, I mean, I grew up in Nebraska. It's like beef every night. That's just what it is, right? You don't even think about it. I moved to Ohio, and I was like, why do you eat chicken? This makes no sense. So my wife is like, hey, beef last night has to be chicken tonight, and if it's chicken tonight, then it's pork tomorrow, and then maybe we can get back to beef on Thursday. And I've never really understood that. But the greatest thing happened in our marriage when she got pregnant with our first. About a month in, she began to crave red meat every day, all the time. And it was glorious. We ate red meat for like 4 straight months. And I was like, now we're talking, all right? Getting back to my roots. But appetites are an interesting thing because they actually add direction to our life, and they really dictate like the way that we spend our time. It's the things that we crave. And so John is just asking the question, what do you crave? Like if we each took out our calendars, you know, your Google Gmail calendar, and we took out your bank account, what would it reveal about your appetites right now? And again, remember, none of this is judgmental or condemnation. John's just holding up tests going, hey, this is good to stop and go, how am I doing? Like if I want to walk in the light with Jesus, how am I doing? It's okay to go, man, one of these tests is really hard for me. That's okay. But if you look at your bank account and you looked at your calendar, what would it say about the things that you're craving? What would it say? Would it say that the general disposition of your life is towards God and towards his people and the use of gifts for his kingdom to come? Or would you say, honestly, I've been in a moment where I'm really distracted and I'm finding myself just kind of craving the next thing. Now, listen, do not hear me say, there's this phrase that goes, you're too heavenly minded to be any earthly good. Right? So I'm not talking about, hey, the call here is for us to be monks and we just, sit in our pose, for weeks on end. That's not what I'm saying. But John appears to be saying it is important to pay attention to what you crave. Are you craving the kingdom more regularly than the other things in your life? Or would you say the other things in your life are dictating things? Because our heart always drifts towards, when you go on autopilot, your heart and your mind drift towards the things that you crave. And so John is saying, what do you crave? And he's inviting them to crave the things of the kingdom. And so friends, these are 4 great tests for us. And it's okay for us from time to time to go, am I walking in the light? And John lays out our ability to take a look at that. Amen?